Hello everyone. Enjoy these thrilling moments of relaxation as you watch the story unfold. A 9-year-old girl is pregnant, and just before giving birth, doctors discover something terrifying. Maya, a petite girl, only about 15 meters tall, with a slender figure and a youthful face, makes her look no older than 9 years old. Now caught in an emergency situation, she wears a simple white dress, her large round eyes filled with fear and pain, and her belly, round and prominent, stands out against her tiny frame. Beside her is Paul, a 37-year-old man, his face tense and anxious. He runs frantically into the hospital, carrying her in his arms, desperately crying out, "Doctor, please save her." Paul's shout echoes through the hospital hallways, drawing immediate attention. Nurses freeze at the sight of them, while patients and their companions whisper in concern, "What happened?" As a nurse approaches and sees Maya's condition, she tries to remain professional but can't contain the growing anger within her. How could a 10-year-old girl, still so young, end up in this situation? Paul, his voice breaking with despair, pleads, "Please, we need help! We can't waste a single second." The nurse urgently calls through the intercom. "We need a stretcher at the main entrance immediately." Meanwhile, another nurse gently comforts Maya, trying to reassure her, "Stay strong, sweetheart. We're going to help you." The voices blend into a tense atmosphere, a mix of worry, outrage, and curiosity about the tragedy unfolding before them. Meanwhile, the hallway becomes a chaotic painting of emotions. Some express rage over the heartbreaking sight of a child who doesn't even look older than 10, carrying a pregnancy. Others are left speechless, unable to comprehend how such a horrifying event could occur. Even the nurses, though striving to remain calm, can't hide their shock. How could a little girl end up in this situation? A small but furious voice rises, emphasizing that this is not just a medical emergency, but a horrifying reflection of society itself. But the chaos does not stop there. Paul, still carrying Maya, embodies sheer desperation. His hands tremble, his voice cracks as he shouts once more, "Doctor, please save her! We need help! We can't waste another second." His plea rings like an alarm, shaking everyone into recognizing the severity of this crisis. At the same time, nurses quickly coordinate and report through the hospital's intercom system. Urgent messages repeat rapidly, summoning emergency medical support. "We need a stretcher at the main entrance now." The nurse's voice is heavy with tension, forcing immediate action. The whispers among bystanders grow more intense. Patients and visitors begin to murmur, some even passing harsh judgments about the girl's condition. "A child who doesn't even look 10, and she's pregnant?" The statement reverberates through the halls, a mixture of horror and judgment, as if to remind everyone that something unthinkable is happening before their eyes. The hospital corridor is now heavier than ever. Shocked voices, judgmental stares, and growing panic spread everywhere, forming a multi-layered tapestry of concern, anger, and even denial, as people struggle to understand the terrifying reality before them. At that moment, time seems to freeze, and the collision of emotions creates an atmosphere thick with tension and fear. As Maya is rushed into the emergency room, the atmosphere shifts dramatically from the chaos outside. Doctors and nurses immediately focus on stabilizing Maya's condition. The dim glow of fluorescent lights combined with the sharp commands of doctors creates an environment that is both solemn and intensely nerve-wracking. Nurses with expert hands and professional precision begin checking her vitals, monitoring blood pressure, oxygen levels, and other critical signs to determine how dire her condition truly is. Meanwhile, in the waiting area of the emergency unit, whispers continue. Judgment, worry, and disbelief fill the gazes of those staring at Maya, as if to confirm that this is not just a medical case but a deeply shocking phenomenon. The emergency surgery begins. Dr. Guadalupe, a highly experienced OB/GYN, steps forward, ensuring that all surgical instruments are prepared. At that moment, he cannot hide his horror. What kind of monster could do this? He mutters under his breath while scrubbing in, his mind racing with anger and disbelief at what he is about to confront. The final preparations for the surgery are meticulous. The team arranges the instruments in order, double-checking everything to ensure absolute readiness. Dr. Guadalupe issues a firm command. "We start the surgery now." his voice strong and unwavering, carrying an immense sense of duty and urgency. As nurses carefully position Maya on the operating table, the tension thickens. Doctors activate medical devices, check the monitoring screens, and coordinate with other departments to ensure a flawless procedure. Every action is executed with precise efficiency, as if every second is a battle against death itself. Outside the operating room, Paul stands frozen, his eyes locked onto the door. His heart pounds uncontrollably, terror gripping his chest as he anxiously waits. Each passing second feels like an eternity, his mind repeating a single desperate thought. How can we save her? He knows that even a moment of hesitation could make Maya's condition worse. The whispers outside the emergency room intensify. What's happening? Will the girl survive? How could a child end up like this? These questions don't just reflect worry, but also harsh social condemnation for this horrifying reality. Inside the operating room, Dr. Guadalupe battles with his emotions. He knows that this is more than just a medical procedure. It is a fight to save a fragile life. Memories of past emergency cases flash through his mind, but none have haunted him as deeply as this one. Every second matters, and he is determined to make everyone count. The surgery officially begins. With expert hands and intense focus, the medical team works seamlessly. The sounds of machines, hurried footsteps, and sharp commands merge into a tense symphony, where every detail is crucial in this race against time. At that moment, only one thing is clear. Maya, with her fear-filled eyes and unbearable pain, is the center of this desperate battle for life. Dr. Guadalupe glances at her face. He sees the terror in her eyes, and that fuels his resolve even further. Let's begin, he commands. Nurses immediately spring into action, making sure that every medical tool is in place for the best possible outcome. From the first incision, every step is executed with absolute precision. The lights from the surgical lamps illuminate the tense expressions of the team, underscoring the gravity of this fight. Meanwhile, outside the operating room, whispers continue to echo. Judgment, horror, and disbelief about Maya's tragic story spread like wildfire, serving as a chilling reminder that this painful reality is unfolding before their very eyes. But inside the OR, there is only one focus: saving Maya's life. Dr. Guadalupe, with a firm but hopeful gaze, closely monitors her vitals, ensuring everything is under control. "We will not let her go," he whispers. And so, the emergency surgery begins, in a race against death, where every heartbeat holds the weight of hope and responsibility. As Maya's emergency operation unfolded with immense tension, Dr. Guadalupe, a seasoned surgeon with years of experience in critical surgeries, proceeded with the necessary preparations before beginning the procedure. Amidst the hurried footsteps of nurses and the beeping of monitors, he stepped into the sterile washing area, preparing to scrub in. But at that moment, something unusual happened, something that made his mind freeze for a second. As the cold water cascaded over his hands, his gaze lingered on Maya's fragile body. Even while focusing on hygiene, his eyes kept drifting back to the strange abnormalities in her physiology. Then the realization hit him like a shockwave. Maya's internal organs, particularly her reproductive system, were fully developed, as if they belonged to a grown woman. Her uterus and ovaries had the size and structure of a woman in her 20s, something impossible for a 9-year-old child. Dr. Guadalupe whispered, almost in disbelief, This cannot be real." His voice was soft yet heavy, filled with shock and dread. The moment his words escaped his lips, the room fell silent. Nurses, previously focused on their tasks, suddenly froze. Their eyes, wide with fear, confusion, and disbelief, darted to their senior doctor, as if time itself had stopped in the presence of such a terrifying truth. It did not take long for Dr. Guadalupe to explain the situation to his colleagues. Based on his medical knowledge, Maya appeared to have a rare condition known as pituitary dwarfism, where the pituitary gland fails to regulate physical growth properly. This meant that, despite her youthful appearance, her internal organs had matured at an unnatural rate. "Her body is an anomaly," Dr. Guadalupe stated, struggling to contain his own astonishment. "Her reproductive system, it's not just developed, it is completely mature. Her uterus, her ovaries, they resemble those of a woman in her 20s. He paused, his eyes scanning the team, making sure that everyone understood the gravity of this discovery. The operating room, once buzzing with urgency, now carried a different weight. The weight of something far beyond medicine's current understanding. Determined to get answers, Dr. Guadalupe took immediate action. He ordered a full retrieval of Maya's medical records, tracing her previous health checkups and past treatments, if any. He also contacted specialists in endocrinology and genetic disorders, hoping to gain further insights into her condition. "We need to investigate every detail," he declared. "We must review her medical history and consult with experts in pituitary dysfunction and rare genetic conditions." His tone carried unwavering resolve, but beneath it, a deep uncertainty lingered, a fear of what they might uncover. The atmosphere among the medical team grew heavier. Even the nurses, seasoned professionals accustomed to high-pressure emergencies, began whispering among themselves. They exchanged uneasy glances, murmuring theories about how a child's body could defy natural aging while remaining physically juvenile on the outside. Some tried to rationalize it with medical explanations, but none of them could shake off the unsettling horror of what they had just learned. Although they could sense Dr. Guadalupe's underlying frustration, they also knew that they were witnessing something beyond their knowledge, something science had yet to explain. And yet, despite the confusion and emotional turmoil, one truth remained. Their duty was to save Maya's life. Dr. Guadalupe reminded them of this mission. "We must stay focused. Answers will come when we have all the evidence." His words, though meant to reassure, barely masked the storm raging in his own mind. As he turned back toward Maya, his gaze lingered on the contradiction before him. A child with the anatomy of an adult. This paradox was more than just a medical mystery. It was a shocking enigma that challenged everything they knew. "We must document everything," he instructed, his voice firm yet thoughtful. "I will contact endocrine and medical specialists immediately." But even as he tried to rationalize the situation, a single thought kept echoing in his mind. "This is impossible." The words repeated like a haunting mantra, a reminder that even in the world of science, there are still things we cannot explain. And in that moment, as each breath and every heartbeat carried the weight of the unknown, the team knew they were standing on the edge of something far greater than they could comprehend. Outside the emergency room, the tension was just as thick, if not worse. Paul, who had been paralyzed with fear and helplessness, now sat alone in the hospital hallway. His face was etched with exhaustion, despair, and an unbearable sense of powerlessness. Around him, the whispers of bystanders spread like wildfire. Rumors morphed into harsh judgments. "That girl can't be older than 10. That man must be responsible." Each word struck Paul like a blade, cutting deeper into his already shattered spirit. The air in the hallway grew heavier, filled with a mixture of fear, anger, and morbid curiosity. Then suddenly the situation escalated. From the far corner of the corridor, a muscular man abruptly rose from his seat, his face flushed red with fury. And without warning, he lunged toward Paul, gripping his collar tightly. "How could you do this to a child?" he roared. His voice boomed like thunder, sending shockwaves through the onlookers. Paul gasped in terror, his body trembling at the sudden act of violence. Immediately, hospital staff and security guards intervened, prying the furious man away before the situation turned deadly. Shouting and chaos erupted. A head nurse stepped forward, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Let the authorities handle this." Her words acted as a command, forcing the gathering crowd into silence. Within moments, emergency calls were made. Soon, red and blue police lights flickered through the hospital windows. A team of officers and detectives, led by Chief Inspector Miguel, entered the scene. They quickly located Paul and escorted him away. The crowd watched in grim silence as he was led to a holding room. Inside, under the cold fluorescent light, Paul faced the grim reality of an interrogation. Across from him sat Chief Miguel, his eyes void of emotion, his voice deep and unyielding. "We need to know everything. Start from the beginning." One by one, detectives fired questions, trying to link Paul's actions to Maya's emergency. Though Paul struggled to explain, his words were drowned by the invisible weight of society's judgment. Outside, whispers of condemnation only grew louder. "He has to be guilty. That girl is barely 10. Someone must pay." Inside, the interrogation room felt smaller and colder, a place where Paul's every word was doubted, even when he pleaded his innocence. It wasn't enough to silence the storm of accusation surrounding him. I just wanted to help her." His voice broke, but even as he spoke the truth, he knew the world outside had already decided his guilt. And as Chief Miguel made his final declaration, The room fell into a chilling silence. "You will remain in custody until the full truth is uncovered." Paul lowered his head, his soul crushed under the weight of a fate he never saw coming. And beyond those sterile walls, society's merciless whispers continued, sealing his destiny in a judgment he could not escape. Paul was led into a cold, dimly lit holding cell, where the flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows across the room. Opposite him sat Detective Sophia and Detective Gonzalez, their gazes stern and unwavering. The tension in the air thickened as Sophia spoke in a tone devoid of empathy. "We need to know exactly what happened." Her voice was steady, almost clinical, as if she were peeling away at every detail, every inconsistency in Paul's story. Paul, his face etched with exhaustion and anxiety, exhaled deeply. His eyes fell to the cold, tiled floor before he finally spoke. "Maya is not a child. She's my English teacher." The statement, so simple yet profoundly shocking, hung in the air like an invisible bombshell. Paul struggled to emphasize that despite Maya's youthful appearance, her biological reality was something entirely different. Her internal organs, fully developed like those of an adult woman, stood as undeniable proof of a terrifying contradiction. Detective Gonzalez, his sharp eyes studying Paul's every movement, followed up with a series of pointed questions. Paul remained firm, his voice trembling slightly. "I was only trying to save her. I cannot be held responsible for the assumptions of others." His words carried a deep sense of helplessness, the plea of a man who had already endured a nightmare and now faced even harsher scrutiny. The weight of the interrogation pressed down like a suffocating force as the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. At that moment, the door swung open, and in walked Attorney Delgado. He radiated a sense of calm control, but his eyes held a fierce determination. "I need to speak with my client in private," Delgado announced. Without hesitation, Paul was escorted to a separate corner of the holding area. As soon as they were alone, Delgado leaned forward, his voice firm but reassuring. "We will clarify everything with medical records and documented evidence." His words were deliberate and forceful, emphasizing the critical importance of obtaining clear, irrefutable proof. "We must establish that Maya's condition is due to a rare disorder known as pituitary dwarfism, not a criminal act." He stressed that every detail must be meticulously examined to counter the rising tide of public outrage. Paul, weighed down by exhaustion, listened intently in complete silence. He understood that one misstep in his testimony could seal his fate. At that moment, he realized that he was not only fighting for his own freedom, he was battling the ruthless judgment of society, the relentless accusations, and the rigid legal system. The interrogation dragged on, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. Every question from Detective Sophia or Gonzalez felt like a blade, cutting deeper into the already fragile state of Paul's mind. He tried to maintain composure, but his voice grew weaker, shaken by memories of the terrifying past. The desperation to save Maya, the helplessness against fate's cruelty. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, in a room that felt smaller and colder with every breath, Paul knew this interrogation would decide his fate. No matter how hard he had tried to help, the accusations and doubts would never leave him. Attorney Delgado, his face grim, reminded him, "Medical records will be our strongest weapon. We must prove that this is a medical anomaly, not a crime." Paul clung to that hope, knowing that truth alone might not be enough to clear his name. As the interrogation came to a close, the focus shifted back to the operating room, where Maya's emergency surgery had begun. Dr. Guadalupe, his years of expertise etched into every precise movement, entered the surgical unit where his team had already taken their positions. His gaze was intense, carrying the absolute awareness that every second could determine Maya's survival. The tension was palpable. Every nurse moved with practiced precision, every instrument meticulously sterilized, every breath measured to prevent a single misstep. As Dr. Guadalupe made the first incision, a heavy silence settled over the room. It was as if time had momentarily paused, allowing the surgical team to witness the miracle, or tragedy, unfolding before them. Minutes stretched into agonizing moments. Every movement was deliberate, every instruction spoken in quick, sharp exchanges. The doctor's eyes remained fixed on Maya's internal organs, scanning for any sign of complications. Then, a sharp cry pierced the air, a baby's cry. The tension shattered, replaced by a brief moment of relief. Dr. Guadalupe straightened, his voice steady and authoritative. "It's a boy. The baby is stable." A nurse gently lifted the newborn, immediately checking his vitals. Though a flicker of relief swept through the team, they did not lose focus. Maya's condition remained critical. "We need to complete this surgery now," Dr. Guadalupe declared. As Maya drifted back from anesthesia, her face was pale, her body trembling from exhaustion. Yet in her half-lidded gaze, there was a fragile glimmer of life. Nurses monitored her closely, tracking her temperature, blood pressure, and oxygen levels, ensuring that no complications arose. But even as the surgery neared its conclusion, the unsettling truth remained. Her reproductive organs appeared fully developed, contradicting her youthful physique. Dr. Guadalupe muttered under his breath, "This is unexplainable." Though he did not speak the words aloud, the gravity of the anomaly weighed heavily on him. As the final sutures were placed, Dr. Guadalupe removed his gloves, his expression unreadable. "We've done everything we can," he announced. "Transfer Maya to recovery and monitor her closely." The nurses moved swiftly, assisting Maya onto a hospital bed, while the baby was taken for further postnatal evaluation. "The baby is stable," a nurse confirmed. "We'll conduct additional tests shortly." Though the procedure had been executed flawlessly, the tension remained. Every doctor and nurse in that room knew they had just witnessed something beyond conventional medicine. Dr. Guadalupe turned back to Maya, studying her carefully. She was still weak, still bearing the pain of the procedure. Yet in her faint, weary expression, there was a quiet understanding, perhaps even acceptance. A nurse approached her, her voice gentle. "Stay strong, we're here for you." Despite the lingering fears, there was an undeniable warmth in the room now, a reminder that human compassion still existed, even in the face of the unknown. As the surgical unit began to clear, Dr. Guadalupe gave one final order. "Transfer Maya to post-op recovery immediately. Keep a close watch on all her vitals." And with that, the team moved swiftly, ensuring she received the care she needed. In that moment, the faint cry of the newborn boy echoed through the corridors, a cry of life, a symbol of hope born from tragedy. Maya, though exhausted, slowly opened her eyes, her frail fingers trembling as she reached out for the child. Though she was still weak, still in pain, there was one undeniable truth in her expression. She was alive, and for now, that was enough. Paul sat silently outside the emergency room, where the dim glow of fluorescent lights reflected off the cold hospital floor. The faint hum of whispered conversations between nurses and doctors filled the sterile air, weaving a sense of unease and anticipation. He sat there, his eyes heavy with fear and uncertainty. Yet within him, a fragile warmth flickered, the small yet powerful relief of knowing that the baby had been delivered safely and was now stable. It did not erase his fears, nor did it undo the weight of the nightmare they had just endured. But it was a light in the suffocating darkness. Inside the recovery room, Maya slowly regained consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy with pain and exhaustion. Yet in them, a deep gratitude glowed. She turned her head, and as she saw the tiny figure cradled beside her, a tear rolled down her cheek. With trembling arms, she reached out and pulled her newborn son close, holding him as if he were her only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. Her voice, fragile yet overflowing with emotion, broke through the stillness. "Thank you, you saved me." Her words were not just a statement, but a confession, a heart laid bare after enduring unbearable pain, hoping that this moment marked the end of her suffering and the start of something new. Paul stepped forward, standing beside her hospital bed. Their eyes met, exchanging unspoken words, a silent understanding of the pain, the fear, and the fragile hope that now bound them together. The air still carried the weight of their ordeal, yet as Maya held the child, an invisible calm settled over them. Paul placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, as if to anchor her, to assure her that she was not alone. "Maya, you've weathered a storm like no other," he said, his voice filled with both love and unwavering commitment. "I know you've suffered so much, but I promise you I'm here. I will take care of you and our baby. You will never be alone." Her eyes, still wet with tears, softened as she began to recall everything, from the moment the pain of labor struck, to the rush of being wheeled into surgery, to the cold fear of knowing she was at the mercy of fate. She whispered, her voice breaking, "There was so much pain. The way people looked at me, the way they spoke about me, as if I was something disgusting, something unnatural." In the darkest moments, when her body felt like it was being torn apart, she had thought only of one thing: Would anyone come? Would anyone help me? Paul listened, his heart breaking at every word. He knew the judgment she had faced. He knew the pain of rejection, of whispers, of being treated like an aberration instead of a human being. I know, he murmured, his voice gentle yet firm. Even my own family turned away because of how you looked. But now I know. Love isn't about appearances, nor about what society deems acceptable. I love you, Maya, for who you are, for what you've endured. I love you because you survived, because you fought, and I will stand by you and our son, no matter what. His words hung in the air, dissolving into the quiet hum of the hospital, yet their weight carried the power of an unshakable vow. Meanwhile, the hospital staff continued their dedicated care. Doctors and nurses moved tirelessly, monitoring Maya's recovery with precision and tenderness. Among them, whispers of admiration and encouragement passed from one to another. She's incredibly strong. She survived something unimaginable, and her partner never left her side. That's real love. One nurse, adjusting Maya's IV, smiled warmly. You made it through. We'll take care of you now. It wasn't just a job to them anymore. It was a mission. Their hands did not just heal bodies. They mended spirits. They restored hope. As Maya fully regained consciousness, the hospital halls, once heavy with fear, seemed lighter. Paul, though still bearing the scars of anxiety, held Maya's hand firmly, a silent promise that he wasn't going anywhere. I swear to you, Maya, he whispered, voice steady and sure. I will always be here. We will get through this, together. In that moment, as she held her newborn, as she clung to Paul's words, hope began to bloom in the spaces where fear once lived. The darkness of judgment, pain, and rejection had not disappeared, but for the first time, there was a path forward. Weeks passed. The hospital, once a prison of suffering, had become a place of healing. And finally, the day arrived. Maya, Paul, and their baby were discharged. As they stepped out of the hospital doors, sunlight bathed them in gold. The fresh air, the open sky, the feeling of freedom. It was the first step into their new life. But the outside world had not forgotten their story. Journalists, reporters, and photographers crowded outside, their cameras flashing, their microphones raised. Paul held Maya close, shielding her as they moved through the growing crowd. The cameras captured everything. Maya's exhausted yet radiant smile, Paul's protective arm around her, the tiny baby cradled in their arms. And as the images flooded the media, their story exploded across the world. Interviews followed. We faced challenges we never imagined, Paul admitted, his voice calm yet powerful. But through love, through the support of the doctors, nurses, and those who truly cared, we survived. Maya, her voice soft yet unwavering, spoke for the first time. There were moments when I thought I wouldn't make it, but I was never truly alone. There was always someone who believed in me. Her words touched hearts far beyond that hospital. Their story became more than just a tragedy. It became an inspiration. Social media exploded. People shared their story, their struggles, their unbreakable love. Comments flooded in. This is what real love looks like. Paul, you are a hero for standing by her. This proves that judgment and cruelty will never overpower love and resilience. Even medical professionals took notice, discussing Maya's rare condition and advocating for awareness. And slowly, the whispers of judgment that had once filled hospital halls were drowned out by voices of support, admiration, and hope. Their return home was just as momentous. Paul helped Maya through the doorway of their home, carrying their newborn into the warm embrace of their new beginning. It was not a perfect ending. There were still wounds to heal, fears to overcome. But as they sat together, watching the baby's tiny fingers curl around Maya's hand, Paul whispered, "This is just the beginning. Maya, we'll build something beautiful together." And in the golden light of the setting sun, she believed him. In the story of Maya and Paul, we do not merely witness tragedy and hardship. We experience the miraculous power of love and empathy. Maya, a young woman who endured unimaginable pain and societal judgment, fought not only for her own survival, but for the life growing inside her. She teaches us that even in the darkest moments, if we are surrounded by genuine love and care, we can find the light to push forward. Paul, with his unwavering devotion and unconditional love, refused to let obstacles stand in the way of protecting Maya. He is a testament to the idea that no matter how harsh the circumstances, love and genuine care can break through prejudice, pain, and fear. Their bond proves that love has the power not only to heal wounds, but to Transform adversity into an opportunity for growth and renewed faith in life. True love, perseverance, and mutual care are the keys that unlock the door to hope and recovery. No matter how many hardships we face, if we learn to share, to forgive, and to hold on to one another, even our deepest wounds can become sources of strength to build a brighter future. Have you ever experienced a moment where everything felt like it was falling apart, only to find the strength to rise again? What are your thoughts on forgiveness as a way to free the soul? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We would love to hear your stories. If Maya and Paul's story has touched your heart, please consider hitting like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing this video with your friends. Your support is more than just a gesture. It is a beacon of hope, a sign that love, empathy, and kindness will always triumph over prejudice and hardship. Every like, every subscription is a message to the world that compassion matters, that every act of care, no matter how small, can create ripples of change. Let's spread this positive message together, because love has the power to transform, to heal, and to rebuild lives. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to hearing your stories. Together, let's build a community where love, understanding, and kindness are always celebrated.
Hello everyone, enjoy these moments of relaxation while you watch. St. Michael's Church was shrouded in an atmosphere of mourning. The solemn tolling of the church bells intertwined with the muffled sobs of the grieving, creating a chilling, heartbreaking scene. Clara stood silently by her husband's coffin, holding little Lucy tightly in her arms. The 2-year-old struggled against her mother's embrace, her tiny face flushed red from crying too much. Clara bent down to soothe her, but Lucy refused to be comforted. The child's innocent eyes remained fixated on the wooden coffin where Samuel lay motionless. "Papa," Lucy sobbed, her tiny fingers trembling as she pointed toward the coffin. Clara swallowed hard, gripping the dark mourning veil tightly. She wanted to cry, but the tears were trapped in her throat. Samuel's sudden death still felt like a nightmare. Just yesterday he had kissed her goodbye before leaving home, and now all that remained was a lifeless, cold body. Around Clara, the villagers gathered, whispering among themselves. No one understood how a healthy man like Samuel could die so suddenly. Some said it was an accident, while others murmured that it was fate's cruel punishment. Mrs. Rose, an elderly woman who lived near Clara, stepped closer, her eyes filled with sympathy. She gently placed a hand on Clara's shoulder and whispered, "My dear, I know you're in pain, but little Lucy, are you sure she's okay?" Clara looked down at her daughter and noticed Lucy trembling. The little girl's wide eyes were staring at a dark corner behind the coffin. Suddenly, the child let out a piercing scream. "Daddy! Daddy is trapped! He's calling for help!" The air inside the church grew thick with unease. After Lucy's scream, the atmosphere in the church became unbearably heavy. Whispering spread through the congregation, but no one dared to speak aloud. Some exchanged bewildered glances, while others bowed their heads in doubt, unsure whether to believe the words of a 2-year-old. The silence deepened. The only sound was the wind whistling through the stained glass windows, carrying the chilling essence of a sorrowful mourning. And then, thud! A heavy sound echoed from inside the coffin. The entire church fell into a deathly hush. Some people gripped each other's hands, their hearts pounding wildly, unable to believe what they had just heard. A few village women shuddered, their trembling hands making the sign of the cross, desperately convincing themselves that it was just the wind, just a coincidence. But how could the wind make a sound like that? Mrs. Rose, the eldest in the village, stepped back in fear, her frail hands clutching onto a nearby wooden pew. Her voice wavered as she murmured, "A child can see what we cannot." Her words sent shivers through many in the room. Clara felt her breathing grow rapid. Her fingers clenched around her mourning veil, trying to steady herself. Her heart pounded so violently it felt like it might burst from her chest. She knelt down, looking at Lucy with a forced calm in her voice. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Lucy clung tightly to her mother's dress, her wide, teary eyes filled with certainty. Her small voice, though shaky, was clear. "Daddy hasn't left. He's still here, calling for Mommy." The child's innocent but firm words cut through the suffocating tension in the church like a knife. Some shivered, others stood frozen, as a creeping fear slithered into every shadowed corner of the ancient church. Then, as if to affirm Lucy's claim, an unexpected gust of wind surged through the room, whipping through the black funeral drapes that hung over the stained glass windows. The candles on the altar flickered wildly, their flames battling against the darkness. Some of the weaker flames extinguished, leaving an eerie, haunting gloom behind. At the same moment, the church doors creaked open, the old hinges groaning under the weight, as if something unseen had just entered. Every head turned at once. A tall figure stood at the entrance. Inside the church, silence pressed down like a suffocating weight. The hushed whispers died away, and all eyes locked onto the doorway. Henry stepped inside, dressed in a black suit, his hair meticulously combed, his face composed, yet his gaze was unnervingly cold. He moved slowly, each deliberate step echoing across the stone floor as he approached Clara, who still clung tightly to Lucy. Henry smiled, a gesture meant to be sympathetic, but there was something unsettlingly insincere about it. A chill ran through those around him. He bowed his head slightly, his voice smooth yet measured. "Clara, you must be exhausted. We are all heartbroken over Samuel's passing." Clara simply nodded, her eyes still glassy with unshed tears, too drained to respond. She didn't want to speak to Henry, but his gaze flickered toward Lucy, the little girl still clinging to her mother's dress, her large eyes wide with fear, her small body trembling. Henry hesitated, his expression tightening for a brief moment. Lucy's gaze remained fixed on the coffin, her tiny hand trembling as she pointed at it, her lips quivering as if struggling to speak. Henry's eyes darkened, his voice carrying a quiet but unmistakable warning. "The child is too young to understand. She shouldn't be saying such things. It might frighten people." Though his words were soft, there was an underlying sharpness, a veiled threat that made Clara's stomach twist with unease. Why was Henry so concerned with what Lucy was saying? The unease in his expression, the way his eyes bore into Lucy, it wasn't just disbelief, it was fear. But before Clara could process it further, Henry abruptly changed the subject. His voice softened, but his words grew even colder. "Samuel left behind quite a mess financially. Your house. It would be best to sell it to pay off his debts." Clara's body went rigid, her head snapped up, eyes widening in shock. Henry's words were like a blade of ice piercing straight into her chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. Samuel had just passed, and before he was even buried, Henry was already bringing up money. A freezing dread crawled up Clara's spine. She held Lucy tighter, her pulse racing with rising panic and suspicion. But Henry continued as if his proposal was nothing more than a logical solution. "You know, Samuel was a good man, but he had his troubles." He sighed, pretending to be deeply concerned for Clara and Lucy. "I'm only thinking about what's best for you and your daughter." But Clara didn't believe him. Something was very wrong. Lucy tightened her grip on her mother's dress, her tear-streaked face resolute as she pointed again at the coffin, her voice soft but unwavering. "Daddy is trapped." A chill slithered down Clara's spine. She turned to Henry just in time to see his expression falter for a brief moment. For just a second, barely even noticeable, Henry's eyes flickered with something close to panic. Then just as quickly he masked it. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched, and his expression turned stone cold. Clara didn't look away. She could feel the tension radiating off Henry, could see it in the smallest of his movements. Why? Why was he reacting this way to Lucy's words? If Samuel had truly died from an accident, why did Henry look as though he was hiding something? Inside the church, the atmosphere thickened, growing heavier by the second. The villagers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another with uncertainty, but no one dared to speak. Henry remained still, his hands balled into tight fists, his eyes darkened, shrouded with something unspoken. And then in that suffocating silence, another knock echoed from inside the coffin. The air inside the church was thick with unbearable tension. Whispers filled the space, yet no one dared to speak aloud. Some villagers trembled as they stepped back, distancing themselves from the coffin as if afraid that standing too close would force them to confront a horrifying truth they weren't ready to accept. The candles on the altar continued to flicker erratically, their wavering flames mirroring the growing unease that gripped everyone in the room. Some of the village women clutched their rosaries, murmuring quiet prayers, desperately seeking divine protection from the eerie presence that was slowly making itself known. Mrs. Rose closed her eyes, her breathing ragged. Her voice, though shaky, was loud enough for those nearby to hear. "O Lord, if his soul has not found peace, let us know the truth. Do not let a restless spirit remain trapped forever." Bang! The church doors suddenly flew open with a deafening crash, shattering the silence. Matthew burst in, breathless, his face pale with horror. "Clara, there's something you need to know." She flinched, spinning around to face him, her breath catching in her throat. Her heartbeat pounded erratically, as if her body already sensed that something terrible was about to be revealed. Matthew struggled to regain his breath, his eyes burning with urgency and rage. "A few days before Samuel died," he spoke between gasps, "he told me that Henry kept pressuring him to sell the house. Samuel refused, and the next day he had his accident." The entire church froze. The murmurs died instantly. Clara stood in shock, an icy shiver crawling down her spine, making her skin prickle. "No, that's impossible," she whispered, her voice trembling, her wide eyes refusing to believe what she had just heard. Matthew's words cut through her like a razor-sharp blade, carving into the doubts she had been trying so hard to suppress ever since Samuel's passing. Samuel couldn't have just died like that. He had always been strong, always careful. A sudden, unexplained accident, right after refusing Henry? It couldn't be a coincidence. Lucy tugged on her mother's hand, her small fingers tightening, tears streaming down her little face. Her voice came out urgent, shaky. "Mommy, Daddy is crying." She was staring at the coffin, her teary eyes filled with certainty. Her words were like a storm tearing through the church. Everyone held their breath. And then, thud! Another sound came from the coffin. This time louder, stronger, more certain. This was no wind, this was no shifting wood. It was real, it was undeniable. The villagers panicked. Some screamed, others stumbled backward, while many stood frozen in place, their faces pale as death. Clara's hands turned ice cold. Every nerve in her body rang like an alarm bell. Some people clung to one another, unsure of what to do. Mrs. Rose trembled, clutching onto a wooden pew, her eyes wide with terror. "Dear God, this cannot be happening." Some of the women fell to their knees, praying feverishly, their voices rising in desperate pleas for divine protection. But Clara couldn't turn away. None of this could be a coincidence. Everything pointed to a horrifying question she had never dared to ask. Had Samuel never actually died? Her chest tightened, her hands clenching into fists, forcing herself to remain calm amidst the chaos. "Matthew," her voice was hoarse. "Are you certain?" Matthew swallowed hard, then nodded firmly, his eyes unwavering. "I swear on my honor, Clara. I couldn't stay silent any longer. Samuel told me, right before his accident, that he never trusted Henry." The shattered pieces in Clara's mind began to fall into place. Henry, his relentless pressure to sell the house, Samuel's sudden, unexplained death, Henry's eerie insistence that she sell the house right after, and now the knocking inside the coffin. Thud, thud, thud. This time the sound was faster, stronger, more desperate. No one could deny it anymore. Something or someone was inside. Panic swept through the villagers. Some ran towards the exit, but no one dared to step outside, as if an invisible force kept them trapped. A man shouted, "We can't just leave it like this." A woman fell to her knees, sobbing, "What if he's still alive?" But amidst the chaos, Henry remained silent. Clara spun around to face him, her eyes burning with rage. "Henry, tell me the truth. Did you have anything to do with this?" Henry stiffened. His gaze darted nervously, his hands clenched into fists, his breathing quickened. Every eye in the church turned to him, but before Henry could say a word, a horrifying sound shattered the tension. Thud! 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 This time the knocking wasn't just noise. It was forceful. It was frenzied. It was desperate, as if someone inside the coffin was pleading for help. Some villagers screamed, others collapsed to the floor, eyes wide with horror. Clara felt the blood in her veins freeze solid. Lucy clung to her dress, sobbing. "Mommy, Daddy is calling for you." The entire church was paralyzed. And then the church doors swung open again. A voice rang out, firm and commanding. "Open the coffin immediately!" Clara turned toward the source of the voice. It was Father Manuel. The knocking from inside the coffin was no illusion. It was real, loud, persistent, desperate. Thud! 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 The church fell into complete silence. No one moved. No one spoke. No one knew what to do. Some of the women clutched their crosses, their hands trembling. Others grabbed onto each other, whispering frantic prayers. But even God couldn't erase the terror that now consumed the room. A few villagers tried to run for the door, but their legs felt weak. They remained frozen in place, paralyzed by the weight of fear. Every face had turned pale. Every breath was shallow and panicked, as if an invisible hand was tightening around their throats. And then in the suffocating silence, a voice cut through, sharp and chilling. "No one is opening that coffin." Gasps filled the church as heads turned. Henry stood there, rigid, eyes bloodshot, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His entire body was tense, as if ready to lunge at anyone who dared take another step toward the coffin. His forehead glistened with sweat. His voice was low but firm, trembling with barely restrained panic. But behind the anger was fear. James, one of the older men in the village, stepped forward, his eyes steely and unwavering. "Henry, why are you afraid of opening it? If you have nothing to hide, let us see what's inside." All eyes bore into Henry. He shook his head wildly, stepping back. His voice wavered, his breath unsteady. "No, this is blasphemy. You're all making a terrible mistake." But James didn't budge. He took another step forward, his voice unwavering. "No, Henry, the only one who's afraid here is you." At that moment, the doors burst open once more. A powerful gust of wind rushed inside, flinging the black funeral drapes into the air. A figure stepped into the church, Dr. Esteban. His face was ashen, his breathing ragged. He had run to get here. The villagers turned to him, their silence deafening. And then, his voice rang through the church like a hammer striking metal. "Stop everything!" The church froze. Clara felt a shudder course through her spine. Lucy buried her face in her mother's dress, sobbing. Dr. Esteban's voice was grim as he delivered the words that sent a chill through every soul in that church. Samuel's death certificate was signed by a doctor who does not exist. A deadly silence. And then, "Open the coffin!" Esteban's shout sliced through the suffocating silence of the church like a blade. The entire room plunged into a deathly stillness, with only his frantic voice echoing in the air. His face was ashen, his breath ragged, as though he had run with everything he had just to get here. Samuel's death certificate was forged. No one officially confirmed his death. "We must open the coffin immediately." Gasps rippled through the villages. Some people stared in open-mouthed horror, while hushed murmurs of panic spread like wildfire. A few clung to one another, while others collapsed to their knees, whispering desperate prayers. Many backed away from the coffin, as though it held something beyond their darkest fears. No one dared to breathe, no one dared to speak. Every gaze remained locked onto the oak coffin at the center of the church. Henry, standing closest to it, suddenly stumbled back. His entire body trembled, his bloodshot eyes wild, as if a monster had just ripped through the veil of his soul and exposed his deepest secrets. He gasped for air, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, unable to form words. "No, no, this is wrong. This is all a mistake." His voice was hoarse, frantic, like a man cornered with no escape. But no one believed him anymore. They had seen his reaction. They had felt the sheer terror radiating from every movement of his body. And that alone told them the horrifying truth. Henry was hiding something. James, the village elder, took a slow step forward. His sharp eyes swept over the crowd, then settled on Henry. He didn't speak. He simply turned to Matthew and gave a firm nod. No more words were needed. Without hesitation, Matthew and James moved toward the coffin. The villagers parted, forming a circle around them, holding their breath, their eyes glued to every motion. Just as they placed their hands on the coffin's lid, Henry let out a deranged scream. "Don't open it! Nobody touch it!" He lunged forward in desperation, but Matthew shoved him aside, sending him crashing onto the cold church floor. Henry scrambled to get up, but James was already there, his firm hand pressing down on Henry's shoulder, pinning him in place. The entire church held its breath. The coffin lid was lifted. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Samuel was alive. His chest rose and fell weakly. His lips were dry and cracked, his eyes unfocused but open. Screams erupted through the church. Some women collapsed in shock. Some sobbed hysterically. Others covered their mouths, their hands trembling, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. Samuel had not died. He was lying inside the very coffin that was meant to be his grave. The world around Clara faded into nothingness. All she could see was Samuel, the man she had believed was gone forever. Lucy moved first. The little girl threw herself forward, tears streaming down her face, her cries ripping through the stunned silence. "Daddy! Daddy!" Samuel blinked slowly, his lips parting as though trying to speak, but he was too weak. Lucy grasped his freezing hand, her tiny fingers squeezing tightly, as if letting go would make him disappear again. Clara collapsed beside him, her trembling hands reaching for his face. Her breath hitched, her heart pounded erratically. Samuel, and then at last her tears broke free. Samuel had returned from the dead. Henry, still pinned in place, went rigid. His wide, panicked eyes darted between the coffin and the furious villagers. His lips trembled, trying to form words, but nothing came. And then he cracked. His body shook violently as he muttered incoherently. His breath hitched in short, panicked gasps. But it was too late. The villagers turned on him. Shouts of rage erupted. Some pointed at him, screaming accusations. Matthew strode forward, his fury blazing. "You buried him alive." Henry shook his head furiously. No, I didn't know. I didn't mean to. But no one believed him. Samuel was breathing, alive, and Henry's lies had finally collapsed. Clara clutched Samuel, her voice shaking. "Help him! Someone get water!" Villagers rushed in, some fetching water, others running outside to call an ambulance. Lucy tugged at her father's hand, her tiny voice breaking through her sobs. "Daddy, don't sleep. Please don't sleep." Samuel's lips curled weakly, a faint, fragile smile. "I won't leave you, I promise." But even as relief washed over them, one truth remained unshakable. Samuel had been buried alive, and the one responsible would pay. The atmosphere in the church grew heavier, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were pressing in. The knocking from the coffin had stopped, but its echoes still haunted everyone, making their skin crawl with dread. Samuel was alive. He had been buried alive. And the only person who had any reason to cover this up was Henry. Every gaze in the church locked onto him. Henry stood there, paralyzed, drenched in sweat, his face a ghostly white. His fists clenched and unclenched, his breath rapid, erratic. He knew there was no way out. Matthew took a step forward. His expression was dark, his breath was heavy. He seized Henry by the collar, yanking him forward. His voice was ice cold. "What did you do to Samuel?" Henry's mouth opened, but no words came out. "Tell me! What did you do?" Crack! A punch landed hard against Henry's jaw. He staggered back, gripping his face where Matthew's fist had struck. Blood trickled from his split lip. The church erupted. Some villagers surged forward, screaming in fury. Others clutched at their chests, overwhelmed. Henry trembled. He lowered his head, shoulders shaking, and then he broke. Tears spilled down his pale face. He sobbed. "I didn't mean for him to die. I swear I didn't want him dead." No one felt pity. Not anymore. Matthew snarled. "What did you do?" Henry shuddered. His lips parted. His voice was barely a whisper. I just wanted Samuel to sign the papers to sell the house, but he refused." Clara's nails dug into her palms, her breathing shallow. "So what did you do?" Henry's voice cracked. "I put something in his drink, just enough to make him unconscious. Just for a little while." A roar of outrage swept through the church. Some villagers gasped, others cursed his name. "Samuel was allergic. I didn't know. I didn't think it would put him in a coma." Matthew's jaw tightened. "But you let him die. You faked his death certificate. You buried him alive!" Silence. Henry didn't fight back. He couldn't. The truth was out. Some villagers broke down, sobbing. Others clenched their fists in rage. Clara clutched Lucy tightly, her entire body trembling. If Lucy hadn't noticed, if they hadn't opened the coffin, Samuel would have died. The thought made her sick. There was no forgiveness for Henry. Sirens blared. The church doors slammed open. Sheriff Anderson stormed in, flanked by officers. His sharp gaze swept across the chaos before landing on Henry. "Someone explain what the hell is going on here." Matthew didn't hesitate. "He buried Samuel alive." The villagers erupted, shouting in agreement. The sheriff's face hardened. He turned to Henry. "Henry Jimenez, you are under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and bribery." Handcuffs clicked around Henry's wrists. No, it was an accident." Henry struggled, but the officers restrained him. "Your words will be used against you in court." As Henry was dragged away, the villagers cheered. Samuel was saved. Henry was caught. Justice had won. Samuel was rushed to the hospital that very night. The ambulance sped away from St. Michael's Church, its siren piercing through the stillness of the night, leaving behind the stunned gazes of the villagers who had yet to recover from their shock. On the way, Clara held Samuel's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face, while Lucy clung to her father's arm, her tiny face soaked with tears, her clear eyes filled with worry. "Daddy, please don't leave me." Samuel tried to smile, but his lips were dry, his throat burning. He could do nothing but squeeze the hands of his wife and daughter, as if to reassure them that he would not leave again. By the time the ambulance arrived at St. Stephen's Hospital, the doctors rushed in immediately. Samuel was taken to the emergency room. While Clara and Lucy waited outside, their hearts gripped by fear. The air was so heavy it felt suffocating. Clara held Lucy tightly, trying to stay calm, but she couldn't stop the sobs that shook her body. The horrifying images from the church still haunted her. The knocking from inside the coffin, Samuel's pale face when the lid was finally opened. Time crawled by, stretching endlessly. Every second, every minute was torture. Each time the hospital room door creaked open, Clara's head shot up, only to sink in disappointment when no news came of Samuel. Lucy had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, exhausted. Yet the dried streaks of tears still remained on her tiny lashes. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor finally emerged. Clara rushed forward, her heart pounding wildly, her hands clutching at his coat, her voice trembling with fear. "My husband, how is he? Will he make it?" The doctor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice calm and comforting. "He has made it through the critical stage. His body is severely dehydrated, and his mental state has suffered, but he will survive. Right now, Samuel is still weak, but he wants to see both of you immediately." Clara collapsed, sobbing in relief as tears of pure gratitude poured down her face. Lucy stirred, rubbing her tiny face against her mother's hand, before her eyes lit up upon hearing the news. "Daddy is really alive?" Clara nodded, hugging her daughter tightly before quickly carrying her into the hospital room. There, Samuel lay on the bed, still frail, but his eyes had regained their light. Samuel gave a tired smile, but his gaze overflowed with love. Clara rushed to him, wrapping her arms around his weak yet warm shoulders, sobbing uncontrollably. "You came back! You really came back!" Lucy ran to him, wrapping her small arms around her father. Her tears soaked through his hospital gown, but her voice remained soft and full of warmth. "Daddy, I thought you would leave me forever. I was so scared." Samuel closed his eyes, a single tear rolling down his pale cheek. He placed a trembling hand on Lucy's head, gently stroking her soft hair, his voice hoarse but full of love. "I'm so sorry. Lucy, I never wanted to leave you and your mother." He took a deep breath before looking at Clara, his eyes filled with raw emotion. "Clara, when I was buried alive, I heard your voice and Lucy's, but I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. I was terrified that I would slowly die in the darkness, swallowed by despair. But then it was Lucy's voice that held me back. It was your perseverance that saved me. Without the two of you, I would never have made it back." Clara burst into tears again, gripping Samuel's hand tightly as if to make sure this was not just a dream. "Don't say that. I can't imagine life without you." Lucy looked up, her clear eyes glimmering with hope. "Daddy, can we go home now?" Samuel smiled, weak but filled with happiness. "Yes." "Lucy, we're going home." 1 month later, the verdict was announced. Henry was sentenced to 25 years in prison. When the judge slammed the gavel down, a collective sigh of relief filled the courtroom. The villagers whispered among themselves, some nodding in satisfaction, others remaining silent, as if unable to believe that justice had finally been served. Handcuffed, Henry was led out of the courtroom. He was no longer the arrogant, cold man he once was. Now he was nothing but a defeated, broken figure. He struggled, but he could not escape the fate he had brought upon himself. Before being taken away, he turned to look at Clara, his gaze piercing, as if he wanted to say something. But in the end, he simply lowered his head and walked away in silence. Clara held Samuel's hand tightly. They looked at each other, saying nothing, yet both understood that it was finally over. That same day, Samuel, Clara, and Lucy returned to their home. The sun was shining brightly, golden light spilling across the small yard, bathing the house in a warm glow, as if all the darkness and pain of the past had been washed away. Samuel stood before their home, taking a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of grass and the soft breeze rustling through the wooden fence. Clara stood beside him, her hand intertwined with his, the warmth and peace filling her heart. Lucy ran around the yard, her tiny feet bouncing with joy, her laughter ringing through the air. She ran to her parents, throwing her arms around them, her face beaming, her eyes sparkling with happiness. Her voice, though innocent, carried a profound truth. "We are a family. No one can ever separate us again." Samuel knelt down, pulling Lucy into his embrace, his eyes filled with love. Clara rested her head on his shoulder, her heart finally at peace. The golden sunlight enveloped the three of them, marking a new beginning, a fresh chapter in their lives. One where love triumphed over all, where the truth could never be buried, and where happiness had finally returned. This story is not just a tragedy about a man who was buried alive. It is a powerful reminder of greed, betrayal, and justice. It shows that the truth can never remain buried forever, no matter how many lies attempt to cover it up. The light will always drive away the darkness. Samuel was harmed, but the unyielding love of Clara and Lucy saved him. It was a mother's fierce intuition and a child's pure heart that uncovered the truth and brought justice to the guilty. We learn that faith and love are unshakable forces. When faced with the pain of loss, Clara never surrendered to doubt. She refused to accept fate and bravely sought the answers. Lucy, a mere 2-year-old child, became the most crucial turning point, for her innocent words saved her father's life. This reminds us that sometimes children see what adults overlook, and in the darkest moments, purity and sincerity have the power to change fate. Moreover, this story serves as a harsh lesson about greed and the consequences of evil actions. Henry buried his own relative alive out of selfish ambition, but he could not escape justice. No matter how hard he tried to conceal his crimes with lies, the truth slowly surfaced, and he had to face the price of his sins. Life may give us opportunities, but no one can escape the consequences of their actions forever. In the end, this story affirms one undeniable truth. Family is the place we can always return to, the sanctuary of peace, even when the world turns cruel. No matter how much pain and suffering they endured, Samuel, Clara, and Lucy had each other, and that was the most important thing. No force could separate those who truly love one another, for real love has the strength to overcome all adversity. Let's share this story with others. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with your loved ones, and subscribe to our channel so we can bring you more meaningful stories. Your support is our greatest motivation to continue telling emotional, inspiring, and life-changing stories. If you were Clara, would you have believed Lucy's words from the beginning? And what would you do if you felt something was wrong in such a painful situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.